Hey, John.
Hi, George. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Pretty good. Happy New Year.
Yeah, it's 2008.
Here we are doing another year of Blogging Heads TV.
Sounds like something from science fiction, 2008.
Yeah.
God.
I never thought I'd live this long.
I know. I remember back when I was in the early 80s and my first real job working on the copy desk at the Albuquerque Journal, and there was this older copy editor, and he was saying, God, isn't it going to be weird when 1984 comes around? How Orwellian. Then we thought about it and thought, well, no, actually not. There'll be, some stories in the newspaper, remembering George Orwell, and is it really as bad as 1984 predicted? And they'll say, nah, and that'll be it.
It's just the idea of being, I remember when I was a teenager in my 20s, the idea of being in my mid-50s just seemed incredible and kind of grotesque.
Yeah, I remember thinking, God, in the year 2000, I'll be so old. And
I consoled myself with the thought that civilization probably wouldn't last that long, that we'd have a nuclear holocaust, and...
Not really optimist.
So, I gather from our email exchange that you're not one for New Year's resolutions, or you just don't like to share them.
Well, actually, I did make a resolution, which is to make resolutions.
You made a resolution to make
resolutions.
Oh.
Yeah, that's as far as I've gotten, though.
Oh, okay.
So I think that puts me off till next year.
So the resolutions are still pending.
Yeah, so I made a meta resolution. How about you?
Well, I've made the mistake of making major resolutions in the past, and then, of course, not keeping them. So I've got what I think is an achievable resolution this year. I intend, in fact, I'm going to start right now. I plan to, or I resolve to look in the camera more when I'm talking to you on Blogging Heads TV.
Oh, you kind of shy away from the camera.
Yeah, actually, at least one viewer has pointed out to me that I tend to be sort of looking up and.
I always thought that you were kind of looking off into space and contemplating, and I think you look very philosophical when you do that.
Well, thank you. I realize that when I'm thinking, as I try to do on this show, doesn't always work. That I have this habit of looking up, and sometimes to the side. It's as though I'm actually scanning my frontal cortex for what I'm going to say next.
Well, that's what I took it to be, that you were deep in contemplation. And
well, I think people have different ways of they have different mannerisms when they're thinking. I remember a conference that we went to in Santa Fe back in the early '90s on the limits of knowledge. Remember that?
Oh yeah, right.
And the person who had the most unusual manner of thinking was Greg Chaitin, the mathematician.
Oh yeah, Greg.
Remember him? He was this sort of beatnik, perpetual adolescent. Remember, he wore these T-shirts with funny sayings on them and shorts and sandals, and he had this really manic way of speaking. But what I remember about him was that when he gave his little talk, and we were all in this conference room with about, 15, 20 people at this meeting. I was there as a journalist, as were you. And Greg, when he stood up, when he was really thinking hard, he would actually not just close his eyes, but really shut them hard. And his whole face would sort of scrunch up, and then he would tip his head forward. I'm doing it right now on camera. He'd tip his head forward violently, and the way I described it later was as though he was trying to actually dislodge the words from his brain so he could speak them.
I'd forgotten that. So, did you write about this for Scientific American?
Well, I had a little article on this conference for Scientific American, but I didn't have these descriptions of the mannerisms of Chaitin and some of the others at that conference. in this little piece.
Did you write that somewhere else?
I saved it for the end of science, so I did have...
Oh, that's in the end of science. I'd forgotten that.
So I did have this description of
well, I'll take a look at that. I think I wrote something for the Times about that conference, or inspired by that conference. I'll have to find it.
Yeah, limitology.
Yeah, Gregory Chaitin. So he's, I guess, still at IBM, Watson Research Center up in your neck of the woods doing theoretical information science.
And elaborating on the implications of Gödel's theorem for mathematics and knowledge generally.
Well, yeah, and then it's so interesting how he ties that into algorithms and computer science, and this idea that something is just defining complexity as far as compressibility. So
and he had this interesting notion that the pool of provable mathematical truths is actually quite small compared to the infinitely larger number of mathematical truths that can never be proven but can only be demonstrated empirically. So through large computer computation. So he actually had proposed something called experimental mathematics, which would be sort of mathematics reduced to empiricism. So the only way you can know certain things mathematically is actually to calculate them rather than come up with these theoretical demonstrations of them.
Yeah, you actually had to, things that you can only know the answer by, there's no shortcuts. You have to actually carry out the process or the computation to the end.
Yeah.
And you can't compress it.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the basic example of that is a random number, where he would define complexity by the size of the computer algorithm, the size of the minimum computer algorithm that it would take to, say, answer the problem or spit out the number. So if you have a random number, like say 1,000 digits long, your shortest computer program would be print and then quote, this 1,000-digit number.
Right.
So you got a pretty long little algorithm. But on the other hand, if the 1,000 digits are 10101010, you can say print 10 500 times, so it's more compressible and therefore not random.
Yeah. And there's some people who think that this, like John Castee, who was also at that meeting, who's sort of a philosophical mathematician, who think that this has great relevance for the limits of knowledge generally, knowledge in physics and psychology and biology, and I don't. I think it's just sort of a peculiarity of mathematical language. But
it's interesting, though. I mean, so much of mathematics is based on calculus and this idea of infinite precision, and so you can there's always this constant quest to find more digits of pi.
Yeah.
What is pi? 3.14159, and that's as far as I can go.
That's pretty well. I'm impressed. 3.14.
Of course, it goes infinitely, or so we believe. But so you can have a circle. You can inscribe a circle of infinite precision, but something that struck me that kind of, I think, describes what they mean by, the relevance of this to science. Say you inscribed a circle around the entire visible universe, or the entire knowable universe, this huge circle, so it would be like, 13 billion miles in radius. And you could do this by, I read somewhere about how many digits of pi you'd need, but it's not very many to get it within such precision that it would be off by less than the size of a quark.
Wow.
And with a few more digits, you could have it as precise as the size of a hypothetical superstring or the Planck length or whatever you want to use as your most basic length. So then what good are all the rest of those digits of pi?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just an artificiality in that, we don't have this infinite precision, and, mathematics is more digital, and the universe is a computer, and it all kind of flows out of that.
Yeah,
there's actually an answer on this, the John Brockman's Question of the Year on edge.org that kind of got into that.
Good segue, George. Jesus. You are becoming such a polished professional for Blogging Heads TV, and it all comes down to those graceful segues, and you just demonstrated how to do it.
We always point them out, which is even more professional. Which is worse than laughing at your own joke, probably.
Yeah.
But, so edge.org, and you want to describe what that is?
Sure.
And Brockman's annual question?
Well, Edge is a website that was created by John Brockman, who is, strictly speaking, a literary agent who specializes in science book, but he's become this kind of intellectual impresario. So he has this website, Edge.org, where he gathers not just his own clients, and he's got some really big-name clients like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dedden and Steve Pinker, but he also attracts all sorts of other people, including lots of science journalists, mostly people from the sciences and science journalism, but a lot of people from other parts of culture as well. And I guess he tries to find people who just have interesting things to say about the world, about science, other realms of culture. Mm-hmm. He gathers them together in this website. For the past 4 or 5 years, at the end of every year, he has posed a question to this community of people and asked them to send in their answers, and they're all posted on New Year's Day, and usually they're published as a book toward the end of that year. So this year, the question is, what have you changed your mind about, and why? Mm-hmm. And I noticed that John got you to respond this year. I responded as well.
I squeaked right under the wire. I think the deadline was December the 31st at noon.
Ah, right.
So I did it the night before.
Uh-huh.
But you were one of the early responders.
Yeah, well, I enjoy this exercise, so I try to find a little space in the Christmas season to write these little essays for Brockman.
Yeah, I missed the last couple of years, so I thought I'd better get in gear. So what were you? What did you change your mind about?
Well, it's I sort of went back and forth on what I should reply, and for example, the first thing I thought I would say is that I changed my mind about the meaning of a vision that I had in a drug trip back in 1982. So I had this trip that was really, I went completely off the edge. I was in a dream world for about 20 hours, and I had all these visions, and I came out of it thinking that I had solved the secret of the universe, and I really was convinced.
What were you on?
It was some kind of supercharged LSD-type substance that came from a secret government program.
Oh, okay. You weren't taking swigging ketamine and ether or any Hunter S. Thompson kind of.
Well, it wasn't too far away from that, but I became convinced that, and I think I've mentioned this on Blogging Heads before, and I've written about it in my books. I became convinced that I was God. I was the creator of the universe. And I was really neurotic and fearful, as well as being kind of joyful and full of creative spirit.
So you're kind of like the demiurge
exactly.
in Gnosticism.
Yeah, and in fact, I only discovered later that Gnosticism had this notion of a neurotic or even insane God. I thought it was something I'd stumbled on, and I thought that this vision of the Creator explained why creation is both beautiful and joyful and cruel and painful, that it reflects this kind of complex identity of the Creator.
So it all came together.
Yeah, and I really believed this for a while, or at least sort of part of, how we compartmentalize things. And then I gradually accepted that there's no, sort of the rational mind, part of my mind, such as it is, took over and decided that this was just obviously projecting my own personality. So
how long did it take you to arrive at
Well,
that?
I really only made up my mind once and for all about a week ago. So.
So for all those years you believed you were God.
No, actually, I changed my mind in the course of writing my last book. So.
Yeah, that's a humbling experience.
Yeah.
Writing a book.
Yeah, when you kind of really think hard about some particular issue. But I didn't have the guts to write about that, or I thought that Brockman might send it back and say, come on, I want science. This is, I don't know what this is.
Well, I think you probably would have used it. But so tell us what you did instead.
Well,
I mean, I've read it. But,
so instead I decided to go with the mind-body problem. In my first book, The End of Science, I said I didn't think it was solvable. I just thought that consciousness was scientifically irreducible. And
so you were kind of a new Mysterian.
Yeah, so Mysterian is this term coined by Owen Flanagan, the philosopher, to describe people who think that consciousness will never be solved. And I was a Mysterian, and I just recently have come to think that there is a way to solve the mind-body problem. It might not be as philosophically satisfying as some people would like, but it will be a very powerful, pragmatic theory, and it's a theory that would be based on neural coding. Sort of
right, so it's cracking the neural code is how you've put it before, right? Yeah. So you're really you're optimistic about that.
Well, I go back and forth. I sort of hedge my bets a little bit in my essay, but I think it's possible that it could lead to practical breakthroughs in our understanding of mental illness, and also methods of controlling our own minds. So it'll be analogous. The way I put it is, it will be analogous to quantum mechanics, which hasn't really made the world comprehensible, but has given us enormous power to manipulate nature at micro scales.
I guess I'm kind of dubious that there is a neural code.
Why?
I mean, I think obviously there's some kind of code, but I sort of suspect it's different for every single brain on Earth.
I think you're right.
Every brain kind of develops its own sort of little pigeon code for different parts to communicate. Actually, what sort of made me think in that direction was another one of these Edge posts by Stephen Koslin.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Explain what Koslin said.
I mean, he was basically saying that, I can't remember exactly what he changed his mind about, but he used his answer as a vehicle to talk about the fact that the genome can specify just such a very tiny amount of the structure in the brain, and that basically it just has, code in the genome that says things like, okay, now start making a whole bunch of neurons, and so many that a lot of them have to be killed off through so-called programmed cell death, and the programmed cell death is based on what's coming in through your senses and the environment. So basically the idea that all the genome is saying, to vastly oversimplify, is spit out a whole bunch of neurons, and then these neurons, this mess, this tangle, is sculpted by your interaction with the outside world.
Yes.
Through your senses. So as a result, the environment is going to have just much more effect on the structure of the brain, and possibly on the development of the code, which is how I was thinking of it. I don't think he quite said that, than in the genome. And if the genome can't specify the code, then it might be different for every person.
Yeah, I thought this was one of the best set of responses that Brockman has ever gotten to...
I was just dipping into this last night, and every time I clicked on one, it was just great. It was, 164 contributors, 111,530 words. That's a thick book.
Yeah, and I thought that, one of the fascinating patterns was that there were contradictory sets of responses. So there were actually
there's nice tensions.
Yeah, so and one of them was over the mind-body problem in consciousness. So I had my little sort of dumbed-down journalistic explanation of how the mind-body problem might be solved. There were some other responses along those same lines. There was one from Terry Sanowski, for example, a very good neuroscientist at the Salk Institute, about a particular type of neural code that he thought might lead to great advances in understanding how the brain works. It's
having to do with the rhythm of the firing.
That's right, and so the precise timing of neural spikes matters. These are called temporal codes. It's a tremendous controversy in neuroscience right now. Sanowski is betting that temporal codes will turn out to be very important and will lead...
they're believed, it's accepted they're important in other kinds of neural processing, isn't it? But just not in the...
It's accepted that they're important for the initial burst of sensory input from our eyes and ears.
Oh, okay. So the brightness of the light is coded by how fast the neurons are pulsing.
And so timing is sort of relevant in a trivial way because we need to keep track of the order of external events. But he's saying that it might be important also once things get into our brains and then all this internal processing is going on.
I see.
There was another entry by Stanislas Dehaene, I think it's pronounced.
Yeah, right.
And I hadn't heard of this. He was saying that there's a new theory from a guy named Carl Friston, a British neuroscientist, that involves, it's this kind of Bayesian model of neurocomputation that Dehaene said has tremendous explanatory power, or at least potentially has tremendous explanatory power. And again, it's a type of neural coding. So you've got this set of responses that are saying, we're on the verge of really understanding how the brain works. And then there's this whole other set of responses on the EDGE website from people who are doubting whether this kind of reductionist approach to understanding the brain and mind will really work. Just along the lines that you mentioned in Kozlin's entry. So there are other people.
Yeah, I was just looking at Kozlin again, and basically what he was saying, he used to believe that you could analyze the brain on all these different levels, whether, the molecular level, the circuit level, the brain and society level interacting with other brains, and that each of these levels could be essentially sealed off from the one above and below. And now he's saying he doesn't believe that you have to consider the brain within its context and within its environment in order to understand it.
Yes.
Which would, possibly, I don't know if he would say this, but it seems like it may cast some doubt on the neural code idea. But on the other hand, you could imagine that the code itself was genetically determined, and that was one of the few basic things that was there in the genome that, that wasn't sculpted by the environment.
Yeah, I think. I guess the hope would be that we will learn enough about the code. I think you're right, and actually I've written an article about how, in a way, each neural code of each individual has to be completely individual and shaped by our own individual life histories and the cultural context in which we develop. But that there may be general principles of coding that apply to all people, and once we grasp those general principles, we might learn a lot. We might learn enough to solve some problems about how the brain works and about how it doesn't work, why we get certain disorders.
Well, yeah, so you could have like Chomsky's idea that there's this deep structure to natural language, even though we have all these different instances of how this is played out in the world.
Right.
So the Chinese doesn't seem anything like English, and yet on a deeper level, there's structural similarities.
And this is true, of course, of the genome as well. So each human genome, except for identical twins, and even with identical twins, there are changes in the way the genome is manifested that are brought about by the different experiences and environments of identical twins, but we still have these universal principles of inheritance that we understand now, and that, in theory, can lead to great control over our.
But you might be able, but your brain or your genome can, opportunistically kind of jury rig all these different, parts in its own unique way, perhaps.
Yeah. But there were some people who were doubting at least the explanatory power of neurocoding. I'll just rattle off a few that some of whom are surprising. So, for example, Rodney Brooks, who's the, last time I checked, he was head of the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT. He's one of the great...
roboticist.
Yeah, roboticist AI guy. And he was basically saying that he thinks that computation will turn out to be a failed analogy or metaphor, that's how he describes it, for understanding the brain, and that we need to move past computation. And of course, that very term neurocoding is a reference to machine coding, and it's part of the it buys into the whole computation metaphor for understanding cognition. Brooks thinks that
Brooks does those interesting robots where there's very little computation going on, and like each limb is just sort of has these little, this feedback with its environment and sensing what it's walking over. And
that's right. So he's got
this whole idea of embeddedness.
Yeah, instead of having a central top-down brain-like control mechanism, he tries to sort of distribute intelligence into the actual moving parts of the machine. But basically, over the last 10 years or so, I think he's thrown up his hands and said, we're missing something when it comes to trying to understand how minds work. And none of our approaches are really working. We need something entirely new. And he's basically reiterating that here. You already mentioned Steve Koslin, another AI guy in here, Roger Schank, is basically saying, he's basically saying AI has been a failure, and it will continue to be a failure. We're not going to have general purpose intelligent machines along the lines of HAL in the movie 2001. That's just not going to happen anytime in the near future. And I think that's an implicit critique of the neurocoding method of understanding the brain. There was a guy named Leo Cahopa, a neuroscientist at UC Davis. He had a little essay that was interesting, and again, I think it's sort of an anti-reductionist message. He pointed out that the buzzword in neuroscience these days is neuroplasticity, and which means that our brains are constantly and massively rewiring themselves, at least synaptic connections, but also we have neurons being created all the time. And yet he says, in spite of this, the great mystery is that our identities, ourselves, our personalities, remain stable throughout our lives.
That doesn't seem surprising to me, though.
Well, it's surprising.
I mean, the fact that every cell in your body is replaced, with great frequency, and yet the overall structures, endures.
Yeah, I guess it's not just that the cells endure in the brain. Although the cells do, for the most part, endure in the brain, they are constantly the connections between them are constantly changing. So that's what's surprising. And he's saying that the persistence of identity is something that remains extremely difficult to explain in spite of, in the face of all this massive plasticity.
Yeah, it seems like that could just be a thermodynamic kind of thing, though, where you have the if you have a vial of gas, there's all these random changes and going on and interactions between the particles, and yet the overall identity of the mixture is the same. But anyway, I didn't read that.
That's
one,
interesting. So. I think you maybe you should write an article on that, George. And
the one that I thought one of the very best ones was Dan Dennett's.
Oh, what did Dan say? I sort of
on competition in the brain, and basically, it sort of kind of seems to be edging in that direction that Rodney Brooks was talking about. I mean, he's not giving up at all on the idea of computation, but this notion that that neurons have to really be thought of as competing for resources in the brain, nourishment, and just like, I mean, a neuron is basically, it's a eukaryotic cell, and just as eukaryotic cells outside of an organism, compete and also form these symbioses that maybe eventually, gave rise to organisms, that something like this is constantly going on in the brain, that this has to be, there's like this economy of neurons, and that this has to be taken into account, along with just the computational idea. His last paragraph is, kind of gets the point. It says, intelligent control of an animal's behavior is still a computational process, but the neurons are selfish neurons, striving to maximize their intake of the different currencies of reward we have found in the brain. And what do neurons buy with their dopamine, their serotonin, or oxytocin, etc.? Greater influence in the networks in which they participate.
That
sounds like just a breaking open the paradigm.
Well, it also sounds an awful lot like neurodarwinism, which is the theory.
Yeah, except stated in a much more coherent way, I think.
Well,
yeah, I mean, it is Darwinism, but it's in Edelman's neurodarwinism, it's like clusters of neurons competing in the sense of which one has the most effective representation of something in the outside world. And here it's kind of going down a level, and they're really competing more like like yeast cells or something.
Well, yeah, it sounds as though it's Dennett is talking about a more literal form of competition for actual, instead of something abstract like a competition to represent some kind of external object or event. It's actual competition for nutrients. Is that what he's saying?
Yeah, glucose, and like he's saying that the difference is like a computer is designed in this efficient manner, so down in the hardware the electric power is doled out even-handedly and abundantly. No circuits risk starving. At the software level, a benevolent scheduler doles out machine cycles. But neurons, I've come to believe, Dennett says, are not like this. My mistake was that I had stopped the finite regressive homunculi at least one step too early. The general run of the cells that compose our bodies are probably just willing slaves, rather like the selfless, sterile worker ants in a colony.
Yeah.
Competing vigorously in a marketplace. But competing for what? So actually the answer, to your question, what they're competing for is the energy and raw materials it takes to thrive.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's just something totally different that I hadn't heard from Dennett. I really want to read more about this.
Yeah. Well, another interesting cluster of comments I saw in response to this question, what have you changed your mind about? I don't know if you noticed this. It was doubting experts.
Yeah, right. I saw that, and I figured, well, that fits in with your some things you've been saying and thinking about.
I mean, it was surprising how many people had that sort of response. So let me see.
Because these are experts.
Yeah, these are experts who are saying they don't trust experts anymore. So what does that imply? So you had, I think, right at the top of the whole list, there was a guy named Carl Sabaugh, who's, I guess, a television producer, but he also wrote a book on the Riemann hypothesis.
Oh, right, yeah.
Colin Tudge, who's a science writer in England. Randolph Nesse, who's a psychiatrist who has bought into the whole evolutionary psychology paradigm. And the evolutionary biologist Paul Ewald, who I think has done work on the evolution of pathogens. All these guys basically said you can't trust experts. Some of them singled out, they focused on different types of expert, and none of them explicitly said don't trust scientific experts, but that was at least the implicit message of all of these, and that was sort of, it was puzzling. It was interesting because then there was another set of responses. Lee Silver and some other folks said, what can we do about the fact that people don't trust scientists and they still cling to their superstitious beliefs? Well, here's sort of the answer to that. That you can't really trust scientists.
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of. I mean, sort of. You mentioned clinging to their superstitious beliefs and why people do that. That was another little theme that ran through some of the posts. Like there was this guy, I don't know, Clay Shirky.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was basically. I guess how he had changed his mind was that in the science versus religion debate, that it's possible to take a middle ground and be a moderate,
Mm-hmm.
and now he has concluded that the threat comes from the moderates and not the reconcilers. And one of the things that convinced him of that was reading Scott Atran.
Yes.
Who also has a good post, and this notion that the difference between religious and scientific thought is because it's not just that religious thought or some religious ideas are demonstrably false, and that people won't accept this, but it's just, the reason that you do believe is because they're demonstrably false.
Yeah,
that provides this kind of glue that puts together these little religious cohorts,
mm-hmm.
and then also this idea of, the soccer club theory of terrorism.
Yeah, but that was Atran, is that how you pronounce it?
Scott Atran?
Atran,
yeah.
that was...
I think that's how you say it.
Yeah, what remind me what he said in his essay.
Well, the soccer club theory of terrorism is kind of this idea that, he's interviewed a lot of Middle Eastern terrorists and, potential suicide bombers, and, basically, his thing is that it's not this ideology that's driving them. It's not that they've been infected with this, great spirit and believe that they're going to go to heaven and get all the virgins and things. That it's just more like, you meet these guys, and especially if you're living in kind of a marginalized, God, I hate that word, kind of a marginal condition, like, say, a neighborhood of Muslims in London, for example, mm-hmm. and you're feeling kind of besieged and outside the culture, and you find this little cohort, and, you play soccer together or basketball, and develop these friendships, and this need for these little communities is what's, what really drives these, the formation of these little ideologies.
Well, it seems to me that might be at best a necessary but not sufficient cause. Now I remember reading that, and it's very interesting. But on the other hand, you obviously have lots of these sorts of social bonds that form without people then strapping on vests of high explosives and.
Yeah, right. No, that's true. Yeah, there was someone, I can't remember who, also was writing about religion and saying that he really kind of understood more. He had come to understand more why people became religious, and that they got something out of this community and being, part of this support group, and all not a radical idea, but.
Well, just going back to...
Yeah, I was just looking at Atran again, because I didn't describe it too well, but basically he's saying that I once thought that individual cognition and personality influences from broad socioeconomic factors and degree of devotion to religious and political ideology were the determining factors. Now I see friendship and other aspects of small group dynamics, especially acting together, trumping almost anything else.
Well, I know, I've heard this said of ordinary combat troops. For example, interviews of men fighting in really horrendous battle conditions in World War II, when they're sort of asked what would motivate them to go forward in situations of enormous peril when there was a high probability of getting killed. They said it was more, they weren't thinking in terms of, we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for the United States, or even we're fighting for, our wives and children back home. They said we're fighting for the guys that we've bonded with for the buddies in our troop, the guy right next to you. That's who you're fighting for.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah. Except that...
It makes me wonder how group selection might fit into all this.
Yeah. I'm sure, that's the paradox of group selection, is that, we would like to think that it would lead to greater altruism and compassion and social cohesion, and it does, but within traditionally, historically, within a particular group, and that outside of that group, the relations can turn extraordinarily lethal.
Yeah.
So, the flip side of the in-group cohesion is xenophobia and hostility and murderous intent toward those outside the group.
Well, because you're reinforcing your own, you and your group, you're reinforcing your own self identity and your kind of group hallucination about what reality is really like, and you against the world. And
so somehow we have to convince people that the group ultimately is all of humanity, and that's happening.
Yeah. But yeah, it was more fascinating thing.
I just want to go back to the skepticism of experts point, because this is something I've wanted to talk about in the past. There was a great column in the Times Business section by David Leonhardt in November on something called the expert service problem. So Leonhardt was writing about the work of an economist, and I'm sorry, but I didn't jot down his name in my notes, but I'll link to this column, and it's got all the details about this economist's work. This guy did a study of the kind of advice you get from garages and automobile shops when you've got a car that needs fixing, and
well, he actually did an experiment, right, where he brought around an old car to these different mechanics.
Yeah, and he had actually done something to the car, so it had some very specific problems, and he went in to see if these mechanics could correctly diagnose the problem, and in a large majority of the cases, the mechanics, some of them said, "Oh yeah, you've got this problem," and then they added on these other problems that weren't really problems.
And it was really just a simple thing, like he'd loosen up one of the battery cables so it wasn't making a good connection.
And so the lesson he took away from this was, and there was a question of whether or not these mechanics are being deliberately dishonest, or whether they just are sort of seeing things that aren't there because they're unconsciously motivated to make as much money off a customer as possible. But the conclusion was that there's this intrinsic problem when you go to somebody to diagnose a problem, and that same person is also going to fix the problem. So that person is strongly motivated to overdiagnose the problem. And George, we of course have talked about this in relation to medical testing.
Well, sure.
That's where this really becomes a tremendous problem. When you're going to a doctor, asking him what's wrong with you, and the doctor is the one who's fixing your problem as well.
Yeah. But how else are you going to do it?
Well, but this just means that, first of all, you don't go to somebody when you don't even have a problem.
Yeah.
I think that's one lesson, or you should do it.
Well, you may not know you have a problem. I mean, you could easily, if you never measured your blood pressure, you could go through life not knowing you had dangerously high blood pressure until you blew a blood vessel in your brain.
Yeah, well, maybe you're better off dead at that point than hanging on life support for the rest of your life, or taking drugs and fattening the pharmaceutical industry.
No, the blood pressure is easily treatable with minimum to no side effects from the medication.
Well, what I love about
this...
this...
So you'd want to know that. I mean, high blood pressure can lead to blindness through retinal damage, kidney damage, all kinds of nasty things, even before the blood vessel in your brain goes.
But you have to get these problems diagnosed by somebody who's got a very strong incentive to tell you that there's something wrong with you, and to.
Well, I know that happens. We talked about this before,
Yeah.
and maybe I've been lucky, but I haven't. Most of the doctors I've gone to have taken a very conservative, minimalist kind of approach.
See, I think this is it's a fundamental problem that cuts across lots of fields. I think it's most obvious in fixing cars. That's almost trivial. The medical industry, then it becomes huge. But I think it also applies to experts in general and scientists.
Yeah, what would you do without experts?
Well, I just think it means that we all have to have a higher degree of skepticism and doubt toward experts, but we're so desperate to find people with the answers. I think that this applies to politicians as well. I mean, it applies obviously to politicians, and I guess people have a strong distrust of politicians just from the start. But
well, I'm just not sure what you're proposing is an alternative to trusting people who have an expertise in a certain field.
I am proposing just that you take as little as possible on faith. That you trust.
Well, yeah, that's always a good.
You distrust you distrust people more than you ordinarily would because of the expert service problem. There's another article that I'll link to.
Yeah, but you just get, if it's medical, you just get 2 or 3 opinions, or.
George, this is fundamental. You're in denial.
Or you learn a little bit about it yourself. I think a greater danger may come from this whole cult of the amateur that's been really gaining momentum with the internet. Where now before anyone even goes to the doctor, they spend the evening on Google, scaring themselves to death reading all of this stuff, and they come asking the doctor, what about this report and what about that report, and I think that's basically good, but on the other hand, you can distrust. I mean, a doctor who's been in a field for a long time and seen a lot of different cases is going to have an instinctive sense that is probably pretty trustworthy that maybe this new finding, doesn't have legs and it's going to be, buried by another new finding in a few months. But if you don't have that kind of context and expertise, you're reading the stuff on the web and then you're going and demanding this treatment or refusing that treatment, and maybe to your own detriment.
Distrust, but use common sense. Yeah, I know. I realize that this is something that sort of that cuts in all directions. So even
I just have great respect for people that really have mastered a certain trade. Whether it's auto mechanics, plumbing, or internal medicine, or brain surgery, but it's just a matter of finding the good ones.
Well, let me just give you another example where expertise can lead us in wrong directions. So you've got the idea of the psychologist who speaks to a criminal or a criminal suspect. First of all, to try to find out if this person has committed a crime, and let's say it's been determined that the person is definitely guilty, then the psychologist interviews the criminal to find out whether he or she will commit this crime again. And the idea is that the psychologist has deep insights into the workings of the human mind based on this or that theory and can make these judgments. Well, it turns out that there have been empirical studies of these sorts of judgments, and they fail miserably.
Oh, yeah, but whenever you put science, that's kind of a whole different question of when you put science within the legal context, and the rules of evidence in science and the rules of evidence in the courtroom were entirely different.
Well, it's another type of expertise. In this case, by far the superior method is to use actuarial tables. So, you've got the age of the defendant, you've got the background of the defendant, you've got all these different criteria. You just plug them into a model and compare them to other defendants with similar characteristics, and and look at what's happened to them after they're released in prison, and that will give you a much better prediction than.
But since it's an adversarial it's an adversarial situation, though. So one side, say the defense attorney, who might think that he can get a psychologist to come in there and give an expert testimony after he goes through several psychologists and finds one who agrees that the guy isn't dangerous and they should let him out in the street. And then the prosecutor, if the prosecutor really wants this guy behind bars, he'll find a psychologist that says the opposite, or if he has a good reason, he'll find someone who's an expert on these actuarial methods and statistics to show that this person is very likely to offend again.
Yeah, I realize that to a certain extent, this distrust experts principle becomes fatuous. For example, I write these skeptical articles and books, but I've got the profit motive too. I'm trying to convince people that science is limited in these ways, and what we can know about the human mind is limited as well. And psychiatry at this point is just a bunch of bullshit. But people can say, well, yeah, you're trying to say these things because you're trying to sell books. So we're all, everybody has these sort of selfish motivations. So, I guess you have to bring a measure of common sense to this. But anyway, just as
well, do you ever feel that you feel a yearning to go back to this whole kind of '60s, whole Earth catalog kind of movement, and just learn to do everything for yourself? You fix your own car, you put up your own windmill and solar power. You rely on the experts to do that.
Yeah.
The reason I thought of that was that Stuart Brand had a really good posting on the Edge question too, and he had changed his mind about old stuff being good and new stuff being bad.
Yeah, except that there are some major qualifications to that. So, for example, all the bells and whistles constantly being added to electronic devices, I think there's a big downside to that. Yeah. But listen, I wanted to make sure.
Especially cell phones.
I thought you were going to segue to the response that you wrote to this question, and
right. Mine was just so. I wasn't trying to say anything lofty or philosophical,
but I think you were. I mean, in a way. Well, I know that you were just alluding to your forthcoming book, but which is what we're all selling ourselves in these things. Let's face it. But I think in a way, you're sort of touching on with your essay some of the things that we've been arguing about. Go back. We've got all these things that we believe in when it comes to science. And there's a lot of trust there in what Einstein and Darwin and all these other more modern so-called experts have told us and supposedly demonstrated. But there's this value in going back to the original experiment. That's something that I really admire in you doing. So just
all the thing. Well, I was just having to find remembering what I said, and the link doesn't work. So if someone from edge.org is listening to this, but I found it. So I'll just read the first paragraph so people know what we're talking about.
Okay.
But my thing was, I said, I used to think that the most fascinating thing about physics was theory and that the best was still to come. But as physics has grown vanishingly abstract, I've been drawn in the opposite direction to the great experiments of the past. And then I just described my fascination with these old scientific instruments that I've been trotting out occasionally on our GarageBand science segment.
Yeah, so you're not suggesting... First of all, I have to, again, in the self-promotional vein, I have to mention that I wrote an essay for the New York Times Book Review.
I was just about to mention that. I remember it.
Okay.
You were basically saying, well, since this was right after the end of science came out.
Yeah.
And you were saying, well, since the end of science is, upon us, that now we're going to get all these, really, popular science books are all going to be about history, like Davis Sobel's book Longitude.
Reliving the glories of a science past.
that's, I haven't read that since it was first written, and it stuck in my mind, and I actually thought of that while I was writing my edge thing.
Yeah, well,
I remember you'd said that, and I thought, touché.
But I guess you're not making this point, but I thought a possible motive for redoing some of these really seminal experiments would be to find out if maybe the experts were wrong, or maybe what we've been told is wrong. But that's your motive is really to sort of reconnect with the reality revealed by these experiments in a very tangible way.
Get a real tangible, phenomenal sense of what electricity is and what electromagnetism is. And to that end, actually, just yesterday I discovered a very important life lesson, which is that you shouldn't put a light bulb in the microwave oven and turn it on without first immersing the base of the light bulb in a glass of water.
What? I would have thought that you just, first of all, you don't put anything that is sealed in a microwave, right? Because it'll make the gas or whatever is inside of it expand and it'll blow up.
You have a very intuitive sense of physics, because that's exactly what happened. See, first I just put in a bare naked light bulb. And see, the reason that you do this, the microwave oven is churning out like several hundred watts of gigahertz electromagnetic radiation, microwaves. And if you put a light bulb in the microwave oven, it'll induce these voltages inside the vacuum or the near vacuum of the light bulb. And there's a little argon in light bulbs, so you start getting these plasma effects, and you see these really cool purple lightning bolts in the bulb, and then it'll turn kind of green in different colors, and then it explodes.
Yeah.
So it was a real mess cleaning it up. But then I tried it the second time, and I set the bulb in a glass of water and poured water in it, because I figured that would absorb a lot of the microwave radiation, and it would also help dissipate some of the heat in the light bulb. And then I was able to go for like about 20 seconds, and I got a lot of cool colors, and then the bulb just kind of popped in one place instead of a major explosion.
I mean, that's why you even have to poke holes in a potato if you're microwaving it, because otherwise release the steam.
Yeah, because you're boiling all the water inside.
But I thought also that if you have the metal at the bottom of the light bulb will spark.
Yeah, that'll arc. And the reason that I got interested in this is our good microwave. This is a cheap one I have in my office to warm up coffee, but the good microwave downstairs recently started doing these lightning bolt things, and so I spent a few hours on Google learning how to fix the microwave, and I ordered a part called a waveguide cover that's going to fix this. But in doing this, I ran across all these pages that had titles like "Stupid Microwave Tricks," and there's all these things you can do. Like another thing that people do is put a CD, compact disc, in a microwave, and you get all this interesting sparking from the metallic finish. But that's also a really bad idea, because the CD catches on fire, and you get this really acrid smoke from burning plastic. So
Jesus, should we have all these sorts of disclaimers? Don't try this at home, folks. And
yeah, they do. They do. There's actually some pretty funny YouTube. Oh yeah, we should say don't.
George
do
Johnson is an expert. He knows how to do these things. He's Mr. Wizard. Famous experimentalist. Don't try it at home, folks. These things are dangerous. George.
But it did. But what the good that came out of this was I really have a more visceral sense now of these gigahertz microwaves, and they're 12.5 centimeters long, each wave crest, and which is pretty big.
Yeah.
And that's why in front of your microwave on the glass door you have that little screen with all the little holes.
Yeah.
Because each little hole is smaller than the wavelength of the microwave, and so they can't get out.
You know what I love about this
Faraday
this
cage.
sort of obsession of yours, if I may, is that people who uphold science as opposed to religion as a way of revealing the wonders and glories of nature. generally, the reason it doesn't work is because the way most of us get science, it's in this very sort of abstract way that we're just getting it from books and articles and so forth.
Yeah.
And it remains, it really,
Shrink-wrapped.
it keeps nature at a distance, and the way you approach it, or what you're doing now through these creating new experiments of your own with your microwave oven, but
I'm not going to do that again.
and then redoing some of these old experiments, then this rhetoric about science helping us really see nature becomes much more compelling.
Yeah, yeah. You realize the real basic stuff is really solid.
Yeah, and sort of understanding what an electron is by doing experiments and seeing clouds of electrons oscillating.
Part of, my motivation, I think, really is just how do we know what we think we know?
Yeah.
And instead of just reading about it, and
right.
You just go back and see, why do we think this, and what was the little, the experiment where the scientist posed a question to nature and received a reply.
I admire that. I'm very much the armchair science lover. By the way, you probably...
Well, we'll try the microwave thing, but put the bulb in water and first do it just for 5 seconds and let the bulb cool off, and then try 10 seconds.
Yeah, with my luck, though, the whole thing would blow up, and then Susie will be really pissed off at me. And
well, you don't want to wreck your... It probably won't wreck your microwave.
Actually, I have an old microwave.
Of course, mine has all these little pieces of light bulb glass in it now that I'm still trying to get off.
I just remembered, I've got an old microwave rattling around somewhere that I could try this on. Hey, listen, before we're almost out of time, I just wanted to...
Yeah, well, how are we doing on time?
Well, we just went over an hour. But I'd like to mention one other interesting response to, it's sort of a meta-response to Brockman's question by Daniel Gilbert, who's, he's one of these happiness...
Oh, the happy guy.
Yeah, happy guy. He's really happy now because he's written a best-selling book about happiness.
Yeah, good.
And his entry was about how we are happy, so we like... to have freedom to make choices, but he says that empirically he has found that we are happiest when once we make a decision, we can't go back on it. Or at least it's very difficult to go back on it. If we have infinite freedom to go sort of back and forth on all the decisions we make, we are just overcome with confusion and remorse.
Yeah.
Does that strike you as psychological?
I don't know. I regret decisions all the time, and
even if you can't go back on them.
Yeah, like deciding to. Well, even if you can go back. I don't know. I mean, if I make a decision that I can't go back on, like I would say I really should have sold this stock back in 2000 before the .com crash, and
yeah.
And now I know I can't go back, but that doesn't make me too happy. It makes me think, like, God, what I could have done with that money.
Well, I guess he's saying that, this isn't an either-or thing. There's some situations in which when we make a choice, we can go back on it, but it's much harder than it might have been in other situations. So
I know people whose personality tends that way. Like they'll make a decision and never look back.
Right.
And,
that's sort of a matter.
And they don't second guess themselves. And I think they tend to do really well in business and
always moving
probably
forward.
Stock trading.
Well, the example, what I like about Gilbert's entry is that he personalizes it. And he said that after he was doing all this research, and it gave him an insight into mate choice and marriage. And the way he puts it is that up until this point, I had always believed that love causes marriage. But these experiments suggested to me that marriage could also cause love.
Well, that's a nice thought.
So in other words, I had to think about this a little bit. So in other words, when you make the commitment of marriage, which means that the choice is much harder to undo, that then you sort of become more committed to that choice and happier with the choice than if it's easier to back out of the relationship at any time.
Yeah. I mean, didn't Derek Fromm write a book along those lines back in the 60s or 70s? The Art of Love or something.
So, commitment itself.
Well, I can see that, because there's nothing worse and more paralyzing than the illusion of infinite choice.
Right.
And the fact that you can have anything in theory that you want, or be with anyone in theory who you want to be, and then you'll just basically never do anything and end up with nothing. Or at least without that.
I tried to express this. This is another one of John Brockman's projects. 4 or 5 months ago, he posed a question, what's your formula? Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah, right, I remember that.
And so I came up with some kind of bogus formula equating utopia with, I said that you could measure the health of a society by the freedom of choice of its citizens, and as you go up a curve of choices, you approach utopia. But the paradox is that if you ever get to a point of infinite choice, then obviously you're not in utopia. You're not. Well, it's not even possible in some sense. But infinite choice isn't really a desirable state either.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, because then you're just stuck. You just oscillate between all these possibilities, and you never realize an actuality.
So just one more. I figured I try to tie this into current events. There's this phenomenon of you can't figure out what you really want. You've got a choice, and you're vacillating between the two of them, and then the choice is forced upon you, and only at that point do you realize that actually you preferred one choice over the other. So,
like you didn't know what you wanted until you decide?
No, until it was forced on you. So I'll just give you
my
example. This morning I just went down to get the paper, and, I'll set it up. I have not been able to decide whether I wanted Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton to be the Democratic nominee. I really was
kind of that way.
Split down the middle. And then this morning I got the New York Times, and the big news is that Barack Obama trounced Hillary. Hillary came in third, and it made me feel really good. And I realized that I must have really, at some level, preferred Obama to Hillary.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I kind of had that same experience picking up our little local paper out of the driveway this morning. Thinking, wow, this is great. I mean, if Iowa, would do that, it's.
I know we're only a sample of two, but this could be bad news for Hillary.
Yeah. I found that really rather heartening, and of course, then right in the same headline was Huckabee. But
he has no chance.
Oh, I don't think so.
He's a freak. They're all freaks on the Republican side. That's why. That's another reason why I felt good.
Yeah, and our Bill Richardson, our governor of New Mexico here, came in fourth.
Oh, really? That's not bad.
Well, before he was saying that, he had to come in the top 3 to keep his candidacy alive, and now he gave a victory speech saying, "Yeah, way to go! We made it into the top 4. It's on to Wisconsin."
Well, good for him. Well, he's one of those classic old moderate Republicans.
Yeah. And he's been a really good governor because, the whole time he's been governor, he's been, running for president, so he's been, trying to build a record by doing a lot of things in New Mexico, one of which is going to be a commuter train between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and they're actually building it. Mm-hmm. So, we're getting a good byproduct from him thinking he can be the president.
See, this is when, going back to the expert service problem, if your expert's motives involve pleasing large numbers of people, if his goals coincide with yours, then that's an expert that you should probably trust.
Yeah, but don't do it with doctors.
Right. Thank you, George.
Yeah.
On that note of agreement.
Yeah, I think we pretty much shot the hour and then some.
Yeah. So okay, I think we're definitely off next week. And then I'm supposed to talk to possibly the journalist and philosopher Jim Holt, and then
Jim Holt. Yeah, right. So you're going to talk to him maybe in 2 weeks.
2 weeks, and then maybe you and I can speak again after that, or
that sounds perfect.
Okay.
Yes, I'll have a GarageBand science experiment by then.
Awesome.
Probably not involving the microwave oven.
Okay, that's probably best for the safety of our viewers. All right, take it easy.
Good talking to you, John.
Bye.